Welcome everyone to the second installment of our interview series with authors and artists. Thanks to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for financial support, the Office of Graduate Studies and Research for logistical support, and the library for this space. Our normal format is to interview two authors about their scholarship or creative work, as we will do here. Keith Nainby from Communication Studies has co-written a book about Bob Dylan, and Jim Tuedio, Dean of the college that supports these talks, co-edited a book about the Grateful Dead. Keith's co-author and Jim's co-editor are with us remotely. Hi, guys.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And so we'll loop them into the conversation. And there will be time for Q&A, but please hold your questions until I've talked to the authors. All right, guys. So your books make a great pair. They overlap in many ways. First, you both discuss iconic figures who emerged in the 1960s and who blend folk and other genres into their own kind of rock adjacent music. Second, they both have passionate followings that continue even now, years after Jerry Garcia died in 1995. In Dylan's case, he's still on a so-called never-ending tour. Since 1988, he's been performing. He's logged 3,000 shows and counting, even though he's about to turn 82. In addition, these artists are both improvisers. Dylan always plays old songs in new ways, even when this annoys audiences looking for familiar material. The Dead are a quintessential jam band. Their method was never to play a song in a predetermined way, but to have one musician introduce an idea, another musician respond to it, and so on, until, as they like to say, they were responding not to one another, but to the song itself. Finally, you guys both use performance studies lenses, and that's shown in the titles of your books, which talk about improvisation and concert. So, here's my opening question for each of you. You work at a university. Universities are, on the one hand, laboratories for creative thought. On the other hand, institutions with rules and norms and regulations. So do you bring the creative energies, the improvisational energies of these artists into your work life?
Yes. Yeah, of course. But I think that's because of what I find attractive in the experience of that music. So there's something about me already that's attracted me to the Grateful Dead. By the time I'm drawn into it, I start to feel like it's saying something to me about what I've been trying to hear in myself. And so over the next 30 years, I just keep learning more and more about what that is and kind of releasing to it. And that will affect everything else you do, unless you work really hard to keep them separate. And I don't work any harder than I have to. So since this has worked, I haven't had to try other structured approaches. And so it's given me a lot of foundation that I've really been able to work with.
The way that I would respond to that is to say Dylan himself sort of infamously at a couple of different points in his career has pretty cogently attacked academia. Once notoriously when he was given an award at Princeton in the very early part of the 70s. And again, of course, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in both cases, what I hear him suggesting that I try to take as a university professor to heart is what he's upset about is not academic study in the sense of rigor or in the sense of careful method, but he's upset about institutions that are dead, institutions that are kind of cognitively dusty, or especially aesthetically and humanely dusty. And so that's what I hear in Dylan's critique of academia. And I try to remember that what's important is that I experience the work of those around me, work with students, as something that's enlivening and something that's humane, rather than something that's decaying, that's already established. So
just as he doesn't want to play an old song a new way, you don't want to have that kind of rigor mortis set in.
Right.
You know, Jim, I feel like I've gotten to know you a little better. I'm following up on your answer after reading this book. When I think about the way you run meetings and conceptualize possible directions that a program can take. Now that I've read your book, I hear the philosophers you talk about, which we'll get to later, Deleuze and Guattari. I hear them in your voice retroactively now. And I guess I'm hearing the Dead too, now that I'm seeing how they help you understand the Dead.
I'm a great plagiarist.
Okay, so since we're talking about the question of institutions and rigor mortis, the 60s were, their own zeitgeist. Is this something that you feel nostalgia for as you're thinking about these artists and the milieu they came from? Or is that the wrong way of thinking about what it says to us now?
I don't even know quite what you're asking, so I think it's probably different for me. Because I don't, I do know there's a lot of tendency to reify the past and tell a narrative that we lock down and carry with us. And certainly, for whatever reason, I've rarely been tempted in that direction, but I do tell stories of the past all the time, kind of refresh, because things trigger my recollections of things. And when they do, it's almost always scenes of life that get kind of re-amplified. And those concerts were like a place where not just that kind of thing happened, but the brain was also being adjusted. And because of the concentration that you brought to something that is alive and moving and it's familiar, so you have attunement, but it's exploration because you've never been there before. You can already tell it's going to have a fresh element to it, which you've come for. I mean, that's at a certain point, that's why you're going to actually pick up that nourishment. So when you learn that that's not just that Grateful Dead shows, but it's available in a lot of ways throughout life, then you start seeing it, and then you can start engaging with it and working with other people who are comfortable with it. So my view of the past is always kind of regenerated, and I think my whole movement into the future is regenerated too. It's kind of a fascinating thing, and I think it happens to all of us. But I'm a phenomenologist, so I get to spend my life kind of studying that.
It's a little amusing to be asked a question about nostalgia from the 1960s because I was born in the year 1970.
As was I.
But I think that the interesting thing for me is that it enables me to have an approach to Dylan that's perhaps different than some traditional approaches, especially in the umbrella of your question. In that, Dylan was notoriously anti-canonical in terms of how he engaged thematic material and musical material, or notoriously iconoclastic as a member of the culture. And I inherit Dylan as canon and as icon. And so it gives me a different kind of lens. And I think that one of the things that I think stands out for me about that is that it's extraordinary to me how fresh it is. The first time I listened with intentionality to Bringing It All Back Home, which was made in 1965, I laughed almost the entire way. And this is something that I was doing decades after it was released. And I think when it comes to questions like what we do when we encode live performance in a mediated artifact, that's an extraordinary thing for an artist to accomplish, that the culture around me, that the world around me still feels amusing in ways he was seeing as he's writing songs in the mid 60s. And so that's the best way I know how to answer a question about nostalgia for the 60s, is that it's, nostalgia for humor and lighthearted and innovative approaches to the world is good nostalgia. That's what I would say.
All right, so turning to you, Jim and Stan, can you describe your process of collaboration? You might clarify for students in the audience what it means to edit a collection of essays.
Well, Stan and I are still friends, so it was a pretty good experience, and very full of all kinds of serendipitous things. So, it's hard to know how many things to even bring into it. He and I go back to graduate school. We discovered each other because we discovered that each of us liked the Grateful Dead. So it was just this immediate connection. and we shared all kinds of stories. And then we started talking philosophy and found out we had things kind of in common there too. It wasn't the same, it was like compatible, and it just stayed that way all the way through. And we realized that as students of contemporary European philosophies, continental philosophies, we were exposed to a vocabulary of thought, not just vocabulary of grammar and syntax, but of thought. And these were words that were packed with meaning and exploding with meaning when we started to think about aspects of our life and experience. And so naturally, Grateful Dead stuff is going to be at the core of that. And it was not long before we were hatching thoughts. And then these scholars conferences showed up with the Grateful Dead scholar subgroup, basically, that had already been going by the time we discovered it, and we folded in, and it was amazing. All these different disciplines were trying to understand something that was kind of there. That was the strange attractor for us. And the transdisciplinarity came out of me hearing what other people are grabbing for and talking about through their discipline. And I'm like, I'm resonating with the directions that are opening up. And all of a sudden, we're all sharing that kind of blended language to hang on to these elements that we're trying to pull together and share, kind of not reify, but give life to, so that they can trigger things that will feed on. And so Stan and I just had a natural interest in that, and we gathered these people as we heard their papers that spoke to this. We said, we're going to come back and talk to you about being part of our book.
So I counted 27 different contributors. You're a philosopher by training. You called it a transdisciplinary project. So what are some other disciplines that people came from, and what did that add to your book?
Well, there's musicology, there's the and within that, there's the people who study the lyrical elements of music. There were communications theorists, sociologists, anthropologists, good God, English people, whatever these English people do. And philosophers, business management, faculty member, a lot of them faculty, but not all, but some of the ones who just have jobs out there in the world are very, very sharp people. And that was great to have them in the conversations as well. It was a great blend in that respect.
So you
History. Yeah.
You mentioned anthro, and that made me think of a phrase from your book that stood out for me. It said that Grateful Dead concerts are embedded in an experiential milieu.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little more about that? And if that was that an anthropological frame of reference as you see it?
Well, I'm sure that I wouldn't talk that way if I wasn't hanging out with anthropologists. So I give them credit for helping to shape my thinking. Grateful Dead concerts were not things that people went to, attended, enjoyed, and went home from. That whole influx of people was as much part of the defining context of what was happening as the band that was going to come out and play, or the crew that had set up the staging. And so it was like a situation that that didn't have any autonomy of its own. It was all wrapped up in these interlacing elements coming together. And that became more pronounced as the shakedown scene outside the concert settings became little towns, basically. It just turned it into some kind of bizarre city of unknown characteristics that felt entirely familiar the minute you walked through the threshold and you're inside that space. It's like a bubble. And even when there was a lot of pressure on the scene from law enforcement, they'd be inside that bubble. They'd just be like, what is going on? And not just bad stuff, but just like they knew they were not in their element at that moment. They could take care of something if it got out of hand, but they weren't going to take command of that situation. And that's kind of what was going on, was this element that came to life that was I don't know, the context suddenly is kind of evident in everything that's going on there, even the stuff that's strange and doesn't quite fit.
So you attended a bunch of Dead concerts, and Keith has been to a bunch of Dylan concerts. This is so when you're talking about this experiential milieu, you're probably drawing on a lot of memories. Are there a couple in particular, or is there one in particular that stands out for you?
Yeah, but I'm not going to go there. No, there's so many. It's not, it's implants. So I'm not even sure if it's imprinting. It's got life to it after it's happened. So, watching people, it was like one of the few places in the world where I was like, wow, you can really see a lot of human existence on people when they're in that situation where they're just like somewhere in their head while the music's going on, because it's just turned them loose to be in that space. And if there's two people and they're having some kind of thing going on over a 2.5 hour concert, it can look like 2.5 years. I mean, the way in which they're going back and forth about, this existential stuff in their life while this music's going on that they're absolutely in tune with, but they're having this thing going on, that kind of, there's just something bizarre and attractive about being in the midst of all of this release that's going on, and to know that there's a kind of entrainment that's going on now. The body is feeding on something. So that phenomenon is what all these different disciplines start trying to get in touch with. And yeah.
Thanks. I'll send the next question to Stan. Stan, your chapter engages with Nietzsche, specifically his argument that reason by itself is not sufficient to help us explain the experience of being alive, and that spiritual health comes from what he sees as a blend of Apollonian and Dionysian energies, from Apollo, the god associated with order, and Dionysus, the god of revelry and drunkenness. For Nietzsche, the bad guy in philosophy is Socrates. He thinks that Socrates emphasized reason so much that it killed this Apollonian Dionysian tension that he liked so much. The Dead manifested, as you talk about, energies that Nietzsche valued, including that very tension. Can you elaborate a little on that feature of their music and how it fits in your argument?
Yes, I would love to. First, though, I think it's important to recognize with Nietzsche, in the text that I was dealing with, when we read the words Apollonian and Dionysian, they have a very different meaning from the way that we use them today, or in the way that we've used them for even the last 1,500 years. So the formula that Nietzsche uses is that the Dionysian element is closer to what Jim was calling chaos in his paper. It's undifferentiated. And Apollo is the differentiation, but in dreams. So it's not a distinction between reason and, I think you used the word insanity or revelry. It's really a distinction between primal unity and differentiation, but the differentiation's in a dream. Remember, in a dream, we're not committed to Kant's categories or cause and effect. In a dream, you could be in San Francisco and see Walter Drake coming over the hill. But that doesn't happen in our ordinary everyday experience. So with that distinction, then the way we look at the gods now are through the lens of not the Apollo that Nietzsche was talking about in the 5th century BC, but the Apollo who came to the forefront after the 4th century. So the whole catalog of the gods is seen through Apollo's eyes. Apollo becomes, reason and light, and Dionysian now becomes Dionysus becomes a caricature of himself. Right, where we, it's festivity and revelry and many things intoxicate and things that have a negative connotation. So for Nietzsche, it's a distinction between dreams and intoxication. And in that way, Socrates becomes the bad guy. Not really the worst bad guy. The worst bad guy would be Plato. Nietzsche had a love-hate relationship with Socrates, where he realized that Socrates was really trying to save the culture that was falling apart after the Peloponnesian War. People's instincts were a problem. They weren't living in tune with their instincts and drives. And so Socrates suggested a remedy for that, which was reason, or what Nietzsche calls rationality at any cost in another context. So you asked about, I think you asked about the relation of my work with Jim's and Jason's. Is that true?
Yes, and how these Nietzschean concepts apply to the Grateful Dead.
So first, let me say something about the other papers. My paper focused on lyrics and not on the gestalt of a Grateful Dead show. I pulled one aspect out to talk about, look, in the lyrics, we have something that's following along this line. In other papers, I've talked about how the music certainly falls along those lines. You know, some of the jams in the early days were, you know, clearly Dionysian. So when I read your question, it looked like you were asking how my work was going to further Jim's and Jason's, and I think it's just the other way around. I think Nietzsche historically comes before Heidegger and Gadamer and before Deleuze and Guattari, and Nietzsche did something that those guys did not have to do. Nietzsche presented a critique of a tradition that began with Socrates and came all the way up to the end of the 19th century. So much of what Nietzsche has to say is about the past and the problems of, you know, letting reason control everything. And a smaller percentage of his work is about so now we know, like, how do we recapture the Dionysian and Apollonian tendencies in life is something that he's looking for in his projections towards the future. So clearly, I think that happened to Grateful Dead shows. And all of us had different experiences at the shows. You know, Jim looked at people his way. I looked at people to see how they were moving because of my interest in the body. But the scene itself, in the sense of limitless possibilities, even within a song. I mean, once the song is determined what we're going to play and what the tempo is and who's going to lead it, even within that context, there are limitless possibilities for how the music's going to come out. So that's one of the ways that I see the Nietzschean critique very useful for our experience at Grateful Dead concerts.
Thank you. Great. Jim, that might give a sort of segue to you in terms of the Dead's improvisational technique. You talk about their fusion dynamic, which distinguishes their form of improvisation from that of other musicians. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, it actually, I would say that the fusion improvisation element is something that they shared with very few musicians, but there were others, and they had experienced them primarily from the jazz world. Ornette Coleman, kind of an interesting example for them. John Coltrane, they were, some of the musicians, Phil Lesh and Garcia in particular, were really fascinated by what was happening in that era of jazz at that end of the spectrum. And that was jazz that carried its feeling with it. It carried its life and emotion and passion and frustration and whatever hope might be there, and it gave a kind of bloom to it that was happening now. You know, it was in the moment of its performance that it was happening and that it would exist, and then it was gone. And that was kind of part of the message, was that you know, we're on the way and we've got to stay engaged, but you know, we can't just bring everything that's neat and tidy with us to stand for where we are and what we're facing. And so, it's really about listening. And so this kind of improvisation, certainly for the fusion element is that you've got all the musicians committed to it. And so what that means is that they're committed to listening, and their play grows out of their listening. And so as David Gans once noted to me in a way that struck me as unbelievable and amazingly acute at the same time, was when he told me that Jerry Garcia was always late. Everything he played was late. Typically he was just always a little behind, and he's the lead guitar player. And I'm like, how's this even possible when everybody's chasing after him? But when you listen to thousands of hours of this stuff over time, and you have that thought planted in your head, all of a sudden you start catching all of these places where he's there because he was listening, but that means that he's coming in, and everybody's going to kind of get caught up soon enough, and he'll take them on, and so that's and you have others who have to be ready for that, and they have to be also going forward, and so he's behind, but he's also going, and so there's a really powerful commitment in that, which Deleuze and Guattari were talking about is like these lines of force that operate on a plane of eminence that either has a lot of stratification to disrupt it, or things are out of the way and it can take off. And other things can intersect with that as the whole situation unfolds. And that's really, they also talk about these rhizomatic assemblages, these kinds of things that are popping up with life already structured in them, but they're here now, and they're going to do their thing here with what's there. And so I think that's the kind of musical passion that I find in their music, that is a release to something that gives them a very careful attunement responsibility, and they really honored that. Besides resisting doing the same thing that they had already kind of done, because that's familiar and that's not why they're playing. And so you can see these periods where they're shaking something off because they've done that recently, and it's going to take hold if they don't break from it. And so it's kind of fascinating to study that element as well as it unfolds.
Thanks. I was very glad to hear some of the Deleuze and Guattari vocabulary there, the lines of flight and the rhizomes, for example, to hear how you're using these philosophers to help understand the music.
I'm using the music to help understand the philosophers too, which is always dangerous. So Deleuze scholars are not always happy with what I'm doing with Deleuze because I'm appropriating language. I have found things. I spent my life finding things. And at one point, my dissertation advisor, who came from the philosophy of science area, said, you're an eolithic designer. You need to learn about this guy, Otto Storm. And the guy wrote one thing in his life about eolithic design as something that evolves from found objects. And so it's a way to look at prehistory and the early history of human development and what kinds of things came out of that. And so, to me, that's kind of a fundamental element in Grateful Dead music. There's found objects all over the place that they're picking up from each other and carrying it forward.
Thank you. Well, I think I might want to turn to Dylan.
Okay.
So why don't I start with a question for you, Keith, like one I asked Jim. You and John were co-authors, not co-editors, so you didn't have 27 contributors, just the two of you. Can you tell us a little bit about your collaborative process?
Absolutely. So John is the reason that I came to Dylan. I lived with John my first year of college. He was a sophomore. And when I moved into his room partway through the year, I discovered quickly that he and another mutual friend of ours were passionate Dylan fans. And the interesting thing is I had come to college imagining myself as very passionate about and very knowledgeable about the classic rock canon as it existed at that point in 1988. And despite the fact that everybody who shaped my listening, including the Beatles, by the way, and everybody who'd come after was profoundly influenced by Dylan. I knew that sometimes the radio played like a Rolling Stone, and I knew nothing else. And so John was the person who introduced me to this music that was foundational to everything I thought I knew well. And it was transformative on that level. But then if we wind the tape forward, 29 years, I was offered the opportunity after publishing several short pieces on Dylan's work to write a book-length study. And I met with the editor by chance at a conference in Boston. And I already had, where John lives, I already had a dinner scheduled with John that evening. And when I felt satisfied and excited about the book project that I discussed with the editor and the focus and what they were looking for, and it aligned really well with what I wanted to write, I arrived at dinner and I said, John, and this relates to another question you've asked. I'd seen Dylan live at that point twice. I've now seen him live 5 times, so I'm doing a little better. John's going to have to answer this and correct me, but the number for him is something very close to 50. John, how many?
49.
49. And so I said, I think when we're going to write about performance and Bob Dylan, I wouldn't, apart from the fact that you're the reason that I know Dylan's work, writing about this without you wouldn't make any sense to me at all. And so that's the best answer I have for that question. And I hope you can see why if you pose the question about experiences at Dylan concerts, I'm going to encourage John's face to be back up on that screen and invite him to answer.
Excellent. We'll do that. You can take this one though, Keith. For audience members who aren't steeped in Dylan, can you give us a thumbnail of his career? What are the big themes that people should know about?
Absolutely. And I alluded to this a bit before, but in the early 1960s, it was associated with sort of folk music and especially folk music that was trying to generate new songs that were topically relevant and that took a position on political events, cultural events. But he was always sort of careful to disavow that role and say, well, this is not what I'm here to do. I'm here to entertain. I'm here to, he was always very kind of slippery with respect to this idea that he was at the foreground of a countercultural movement. And he would be asked to be involved in anti-Vietnam War protests and would always be very resistant to be swept into that milieu. And then there was a very famous incident in May of 1966 when he was involved in a very serious motorcycle accident. That time he had just turned, or was about to turn, 25 years old. And he then entered a period where he was not so prominent in the culture, but people who were passionately connected to his music typically stayed connected. And he continued to shape sort of mainstream rock and sort of other forms of rock music as it evolved, especially, for example, the nascent strains of what is known as country rock, et cetera. But then notoriously, as someone who was born and raised Jewish, he became an evangelical, born again by his terms Christian. In the late 1970s, that changed his work for a few years in concert. He didn't play any of the old songs, which caused some resistance. And then the 80s and 90s happened, which the only way I know how to frame that is it doesn't sound to my ears like he found much of the musical culture around him very inspiring. Other people might put that differently. But one of the things he did find inspiring was the opportunity in the 1980s to tour with the Grateful Dead for the first time. And in 1986 and 87, there was an extensive tour that they shared together. And this seemed to be one of the things that drew him back to some of the work that was important early in his career, especially listening to old songs from the early part of the 20th century, from the 30s and 40s. And so he began to record some of those songs and become really interested in work closely derived from that, and sort of drew away from his, he'd already been sort of marginalized in some ways by, synthesizer bands in the new wave era, right? Are very sort of far away musically and culturally from where Dylan was. He became re-energized by sort of going back. He always had this sort of atavistic spirit anyway. And that really seemed to be something that re-energized him, especially after touring with the Dead. And he recorded a couple of albums of old folk songs, some of them dating back in the mid-19th century. And in 1997, he put out an album called Time Out of Mind, which was a very significant watershed for him because he sort of moved back into the center of rock culture with that album. And an interesting way to quickly gloss that for any audience members who are not deeply familiar with his work is there's a song that almost everybody in here will have heard in multiple versions on that album by artists like Adele and Garth Brooks called Make You Feel My Love. It's a good indication of how, starting in 1997 and in the 26 years since, he's become a centered figure again. which is an extraordinary thing for a person to accomplish at age 56, I think. So that's my best effort to give the gloss. And of course, the never ending tour to which you alluded to earlier, that's a lot of twos in the same sentence, has been important also because it's enabled him to do something that a lot of artists from the 60s especially haven't been able to do, which is to maintain a kind of living bond with his audience, appearing on stage. I mean, with apologies to something you just told me earlier, I've never been to see the Rolling Stones play because my perception, rightly or wrongly, is that they're just sort of playing hits. They're just sort of like a living museum as they tour of music that was relevant then. This is quite different to how Dylan, in fact, every Dylan show that I've been to in my mere 5, when I stand in the shadow of John, every show that I've been to, the songs that are the least energetic and the least inspiring are the songs that people know. The songs that are the most energetic and rich and alive for the audience are almost always songs that he's recently worked on, either on recordings or in other contexts. And so I think that's a huge impact, a huge part of his impact in the contemporary culture is that touring choice.
How do audiences respond if some of them are, as I said in my opening remarks, expecting the familiar hits? And that's not what or they're getting that partly, but that's not the best part of the show.
Again, I have to turn this over to John. He has I have ideas about that, but 49 concerts certainly trumps.
Yeah.
So John, can I invite you to answer?
Yeah, let's bring
Sure.
John in.
Am I on? Hi, I'm coming from Milton, Massachusetts, so I hope you can all hear me. How do people respond to Dylan? I have watched people walk out in droves when he starts playing something differently from what they know. My favorite example is the song Tangled Up in Blue, which I have never heard the same way twice. I've probably heard it 30 different times. And one time, which I write about in Keith's in my book, is that in 2017, I didn't even understand what song it was. It could have been any of 10 different songs that are nothing like Tangled Up in Blue. And yet it retains its elasticity and it's still the same song. It's unbelievable. But people will walk out absolutely in droves. And the people who stay behind are what I would think of as maybe not true fans. I don't want to turn it into, like gatekeeper type things, but it's very much the people who know that Dylan is going to be changing things, that he's going to be moving forward. And so they're here to listen. What's he going to do this time? As opposed to all those people who are just going to play things exactly as they were. Keith mentioned the Rolling Stones. I had seen in 2017 Paul Simon doing his farewell tour, and it was brilliant and beautiful. And he sang all of his songs in that same voice that we know. And even my son, who didn't even know Paul Simon, was really enthralled by it all. But it sounded exactly like every time I'd ever heard those songs. And the same year I saw Bob Dylan again. That was probably like 47. And it was all completely different. And yet he worked in the same musical history that Paul Simon did. There's one song that comes from his second to most recent album, Modern Times. And the drum solo was the drum solo from Wipeout. So in like 3 minutes, you hear like a song from the 60s and a song from today. And the people who stood by him and listened to that were really treated to something great. And the people who wanted all the same hits, they just missed out.
So can you talk a little more about the Tangled Up in Blue example? How was he able to keep somebody like you, who had seen dozens of his shows before and knows his music so well, guessing as to what song he was doing?
Well, the music completely changes. I mean, it's not even, and I don't know music myself. I can't talk notes. I'm in a high school classroom right now, and there are music lessons going by. So you might hear strange notes coming from my speakers here. But the complete structure of the song was different. There was none of the same melody, none of the same hooks, nothing. And so at the 2017 show, it sounded exactly like a song from the Basement Tapes called Clothesline Saga, which is a riff on Ode to Billy Joel? Is that it, the one about throwing something off the Tallahatchie Bridge? So it's the exact same music from that. And that's what he was putting the words of Tangled Up in Blue to. And, he played like a 1-minute intro and we just had no idea. It could have been something from the early 70s, late 60s, the early 60s. And yet the story, and this is how I approach Dylan, I'm an English teacher and a writer, a novelist, is that he tells the same story and the setting changes and some of the characters change, but it's the same story. It has the same feel, the same emotional impact. And, I can't explain it. It's the thing that absolutely fascinates me about Dylan. It is completely different, and yet it's the same. And I think that's who Dylan is. He takes the culture, he makes it completely different, and it remains the same.
Jim, not unlike some of your thoughts about the Dead, right?
Yeah, but giving Bob Dylan his due, he's a voice, and he's always he's not inhibited by other people's expectations about who's going to speak now and how. And the music is that part of our voice that comes with the words, right? And we know how to move around in that realm of possibilities for tonality and pace and the strength and silent treatment of voice. And he's taking that, and the music is the vehicle that conveys it. And it's remarkable when he can cross the boundaries of his different songs and start blending them in ways that that carry you into a new space. I mean, that is why they go to 49 of them. And that's not why people go to 49 Bruce Springsteen concerts. They go there for, that same kind of biological kind of engagement. And it's fun, but it's a different thing. That's this other stuff is serious business. And he makes you meet him at the point of discovery.
So Keith, I'll follow up on some of those themes with the concept of being challenging, which we're touching on in a number of ways. We could bring John back into this too, if John has thoughts on it. I was fascinated by a little story very early in your book about Dylan basically challenging the Beatles to be more difficult songwriters, you might say, if that's the right term, less straightforward. Either one of you or both of you, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I can say, there's a way that I enter that question, again, uniquely through my own autobiographical circumstance. My mother was a very passionate Beatles fan. Born in 1950 in the New York area, was a screaming, wishing she could attend when they got off the plane in 1964, like was already hooked in. Didn't have to be introduced to them by Ed Sullivan, right? Like was already hooked in. And so I sort of inherited the Beatles. But because I really love and listen passionately to the Beatles, I love the moment when you can start to, moments plural, when you can hear the Beatles challenge themselves to emulate the example that Dylan, I really liked the way that Jim articulated this. The Beatles' early songs are extraordinary to me. I could listen to From Me to You on the hour and have a good experience. But something changes around 1965, late 65 and into 1966, where observational experience of human life becomes woven into the songs, not just romantic tropes, not just pop tropes, but particular in the way that a visual artist might have a particular engagement of the world around themselves, or the way that other forms of musical artists might. The Beatles' music changes in that way. And it's, easy to hear, I think, orally, which is much more interesting to me, the influence that Dylan has had on the Beatles at that point. And then, of course, people who are very dedicated biographers attest to this and talk about moments, for example, when John Lennon and Bob Dylan met for the first time and what that was like. And so Dylan has commented on this, Lennon has commented on it. But to me, that's not even what's interesting, the biographical particulars. What's interesting is hearing aesthetically the change. And again, I think Jim's metaphor of it feels like what Dylan does, connecting what John said earlier about Tangled Up in Blue, no coincidence that song has a color and also emotion image in it, in its title. What it feels to me that Dylan is so good at that influenced not only the Beatles, but other artists who've come after him, is having a particular view of the world that then becomes engaged through different media, and that media becomes transformed by that engagement. So like how I feel is, there's a way that folk protest songs were structured, that Dylan was changing. There's a way that rock songs with kind of blues band accompaniment were typically played by, musicians in the mid 60s taking up that tradition. And it feels like it's not just that Dylan uses those materials to show us his refracted experience of the world around him, but then the materials change because he's used them in a different way. And I think that that's the really exciting thing to me about listening to Dylan, and then listening to the Beatles in their last 5 years of working together as well, I would say.
Did lyrics and music alike by the Beatles and other artists change perceptibly in the story you tell to yourself about Dylan's impact?
Sure. Again, I have to be autobiographical about this. It's funny to me that my mother's favorite Beatles song was Norwegian Wood, because she was a little bit prudish and a little bit prim in the way that she engaged art sometimes. I felt as a teenager, especially listening to hard rock music. And I often wanted to say to her, she's passed for a long time now, I often wanted to say to her, you understand what people think Norwegian Wood is about, right? Like it's a song about a tryst and a naughty tryst, right? And yet, it was her favorite song. And to me, it relates to your question because the song structure, which is clearly what appealed to her, is not the only, it's not just that the lyrics change and that Lennon is writing something observational that he might or might not have biographically experienced and writing about it in a way that's unique to his voice and it's particular in its level of observation rather than broadly connected to tropes. But the music itself is quite different than the early pop music. And it feels melodically different, like sort of a combination of this driving forward lilt and always being complicated by melancholy and wistfulness. And, that's not what the Beatles I love from 1962 were doing. And so to me, it is both musical and lyrical, to use Norwegian Wood as a precise example.
Thanks.
I just want to mention that when we talk about the Grateful Dead, we often eclipse the incredible importance of Robert Hunter. And Robert Hunter was the lyricist and a poet. And there's an amazing symbiosis between his ability to give you lyrics that are like transportation, and how they're delivered from line to line to line depends on when you took your breath and got going on the singing while you were playing your lead guitar kind of riff to get going, and all this stuff is starting to come to life. And now we land on words that take on a life that you haven't heard or felt before when you've heard that song, because that's just where it happened. And that's just another element of what attracts people to these phenomena and why we're interested in studying those phenomena, because that speaks to us about the human experience, and not only what's possible, but what is really for very many people a threat to what we have, where their advantages and privileges are settled, and they have an orientation that even if it's not serving them, they still feel like it is somehow. It's an amazing phenomenon, and it is filled with people who detest this experiment and would close it down in a minute. And that's another part of its power, is that it knows it's a counterforce, but it's not. In these particular instances, it's traveling under the influence of people who are free to just take it forward and say, here's the path. And it showed the Beatles, but that's not all that got the Beatles there. But that message was growing out of the influence of people like Dylan, who opened up attunements that had been closed off to us, and they grew out of and into the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and things that society eventually beat back into some less threatening form by responding to some of it and closing off access to other aspects and learning how to turn it off in interesting ways. And here these guys come along and they keep turning it back on, giving you the fuel to turn it on yourself. And I think that was kind of the magic element that that people at least enjoyed thinking themselves having those experiences.
Thanks. I do want to leave time for audience questions, but following up on the most recent theme of music and lyrics, I thought we might have another chance for John to chime in. As far as Dylan's literary qualities are concerned, I think John might be especially helpful there. But
I hope so.
you also, Keith, could talk about performance choices Dylan makes that help keep a song fresh or that keep the audience challenged, whether it's, well, you can talk about what they are as a singer.
John, what do you think?
Why don't you go first?
So one thing that I think, the reason that we conceived of the book, first of all, is, I'm a book collector / hoarder. I relate to Nick Hornby on this level. And I own personally on my shelf more than 90 books on Bob Dylan. So an interesting question to pose for ourselves as authors at the inception of the project is, what new is there to say? And to me, that's an answer to your question, in that Dylan stridently insists, for example, as most recently as the Nobel Prize bestowal, but certainly throughout his career, my work is not poetry. People who hear it as poetry and who analyze it as poetry are not on the beat, right? They're not understanding what's happening. And there's a very famous quote, "I'm a song and dance man," he said in a kind of pugnacious interview. But it wasn't just a way of needling the interviewer. It was his honest embracing that it's in the performance that the words matter. And so that's the point of departure for our book, is that especially as a vocal performer, which is what I hear and that fits my own disciplinary interests, there are too many examples to cite of Dylan, even on recorded albums, for example, singing in particular ways, particular phonemes, particular words, particular phrases that completely change the meaning. That if you merely read the words on the page, of course, we would have multifarious readings, but those multifarious readings are at least as important as they're inflected by Dylan in particular as a vocalist on recordings and live and in performance as the words themselves, right? That there's at least as much meaning in his inflection, if I can use that word broadly, as there is in the writing. And that's what we're excited about in the book. There are far too many examples to cite, but that's my best answer to your question.
One that sticks in my mind, I think you talk about in Like a Rolling Stone, the lyric, "How does it feel?" And you talk about the way he lengthens the E in feel.
Mhm.
And you talk about how, what your body does when you do that, how your mouth looks like
You're gritting your teeth.
Yeah, you're gritting your teeth. So what does that do to the song then, if he makes that kind of choice?
I appreciate you offering that example. It's certainly a cogent one. So the lyric, for those of you who don't know, is "How does it feel?" as a refrain. He sings it several times in the song. And it's always, as you say, the lengthened E, which results in the experiential gritting of the teeth when you try to sing the words yourself, or you hear his own gritting of teeth. And of course, to me, the reason that's thematically meaningful is it complicates the meaning, right? Like, it's easy to hear the refrain as, in some ways needling the person he's addressing, like, "Oh, you had everything, now you've fallen apart." And he's tormenting the person. Right. That's one way to hear it. But of course, the song is richly complicated beyond that, and suggests that one of the reasons that the narrator the idea is it's not Dylan himself, it's a narrator, that the narrator is trying to make sense of this other person's experience, is that he's trying to make sense of his own experience, right? And that there's this sense of kind of the mirror of the person who's addressed coming back to the narrator. And that's one example of the way in which the gritting of the teeth, the lengthening of the vowels, gives us the sense that the narrator is not just reflecting, but reflecting deeply, not only experiencing, but experiencing longitudinally. and that it's that longitudinal experience that's profound, right? That we might walk past a person on the street, for example, who's not able to afford a home or who's not able to, handle their interactions with people in ways that are normalized in our community. And the song to me suggests, in the way that he lengthens that word feel, that he's waking us up to the possibility that feeling is never a snapshot. Feeling is never momentary, that the lives of those around us, even this sort of vapid socialite that the song seems to be addressed to, that lives are always more complicated than that. That the person you experience in the moment in the library, for example, is so vastly more complicated than you can possibly recognize in that moment. And that's what the lengthening of the feel really enacts for me as an inflection.
That's so fascinating. So a shorter E wouldn't give us a sense of the narrator's connection to or identification with, if I'm using that word properly, the suffering of the socialite you talk about. But you said the socialite's being tormented by the narrator. So maybe I'll try something out. Tell me what you think of this. One pat reading we might want to come away with of the song is, we should be compassionate. If somebody's down on their luck, we shouldn't judge them. We should empathize with them. But I didn't hear you going there. I didn't hear you saying, oh, it looks like he's judging her. He, the character, is judging she, the socialite, but she's not. Maybe how does it feel? I mean, if he's thinking about his own suffering, doesn't mean he's any more compassionate to her.
Definitely not. And I appreciate you asking the question, because it's an important complication that relates to what I mentioned earlier about resistance to being swept in the anti-war movement. I'll say this as a blanket statement. There's no should anywhere that I ever hear in Dylan's work. And I think it has everything to do with the connection to the Grateful Dead, right? And the connection to Nietzsche, which is the idea that we experience life through certainly categories of perception, and we experience life through expectation, but that those categories and those perceptions, from the perspective of Dylan and the little I know of the dead, are usually impediments, usually things that discourage us from feeling more deeply. But then to impose again, well, you shouldn't then embrace those categories, you shouldn't perceive in those ways, would be contrary to the very project, which is a project that disavows the idea of directedness imposed from without or within, but that instead there might be directedness embraced within community. And that's the best way I know how to answer that.
And I also think that Dylan and many of the Grateful Dead lyrics sort of remind, and the way they're delivered and the impact they have can kind of wake up in you that recognition, for instance, that it's not that easy to tell how you feel. We tell ourselves how we feel, but how do we feel? And sometimes we do that. Like, how do you really feel? And it's kind of that, don't just find a settled place where you feel like you're in touch with what we got here, because it's a lot deeper and gnarlier than that. And until we get there, we're probably not going to be able to really address the situation. So
this is a great opportunity to go back to the literary part of your question,
Yes.
I think, and
Well,
invite John.
now that we've just said that Dylan hates to talk about his songs as poems, John gets to talk about his songs as poems. So go ahead, John.
So what I found amazing about Dylan when I started listening to him, and it was only through Keith, thank you very much, that I started to study him formally, was that he is so involved in storytelling. These are all story songs. But the more I read, the more I studied in college, the more I saw that he wasn't just telling stories, but he was taking from stories. And so there are these lines here and there where you can actually listen to a Dylan song and it would be like looking at his bookshelf, like, what has he been reading? In his Nobel speech, he focused almost entirely on novels. He mentioned that, he learned all of these songs, but he gave extensive readings on Moby Dick, All Quiet on the Western Front, and The Odyssey, which happens to be my favorite book. I love teaching it to my 9th graders. And so he pulls these entire characters out of these novels, out of these poems, and puts them into his lyrics. And only just recently I realized that the song on Blonde, Absolutely Sweet Marie, which I thought was just all non sequiturs, just a fun jam. He's actually got lines in there from Tennyson, from Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. He's talking about Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. It's just all of these different things just plop in. And the great thing I think of when you're listening to a Dylan song, if there's that one line that just kind of sticks out and you're saying, hey, that's a really great line. I can't believe Dylan wrote that. Dylan probably didn't. It's probably a line that he pulled from somewhere else. And I think, to go along with that performative aspect, I think he highlights those, that he makes sure that you hear them. And, in this age of being able to Google things, you can immediately look up, where did he get that? Joni Mitchell accused him a few years ago of being fake, of plagiarizing, but it's not plagiarizing. He's actually taking this entire culture, soaking it up. Jim mentioned earlier about, getting that vocabulary of philosophy. Dylan said the exact same thing. He just soaked up the vocabulary of folk songs, and that's why he was able to write them. And then he soaked up the vocabulary of the late 60s rock or of evangelical music. He would soak all of that up and then give it back to us. And so that's what the lyrics are doing. They're like a delivery device of this entire culture that goes back decades, centuries, millennia, and he's passing it on to us. So that's where the poetry is. It's taking in everything from the rest of the world and passing it along.
Thanks, John. That's great. That's a great ending spot, I think, too, because we want to let the audience join in the discussion. So thanks. A round of applause for our panelists. And if a mic will help, I can come around, or if not necessary. Not necessary, yeah?
Not necessary. I have a question just on this last point. Dylan's claim not to be a poet. As the speaker just pointed out, though, right, there's a lot of allusions and references. Poetry, you cited Tennyson, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. You could add, the beats into this. You could add French symbolists. The entire oral tradition of the country, blues, folk, country. Characters that appear in Woody Guthrie songs show up in Bob Dylan songs. You're supposed to know Woody Guthrie. This all leads me to a real simple question. The answer has to be yes, right? Is there an annotated edition of Bob Dylan's lyrics? And if not, why not? Despite what Dylan says, we need something like what they've done for Shakespeare. Somebody's got to say go listen to this Lead Belly song for this reference. Go look at Shakespeare's sonnet for that one, because this is quite a range of influences. Is there an annotated edition? Any plans for it?
Yes. I would point you to two sources. One is an incomplete annotation, and it's a scholar that it's important, I think, for me to mention, and maybe for John to mention. There's a literary scholar named Christopher Ricks, who's taught for many years at Boston University, where John and I met. John took a class on Shakespeare with Ricks his first year in school, and then the next year when I came in,
Go on.
And the next year when I came in, recommended that I do the same. And one of the big reasons for this is because he was widely renowned for lecturing on Dylan during this course, and has published on Dylan. But he has an annotated set of lyrics. They're not deeply annotated in the way that you might hope, especially with respect to American 20th century song tradition. He's not as strong on that. But it's a beautiful book and will cost you $300. So that's the problem with that one.
We have a nice library here.
We have a wonderful library here.
Which could get it.
And the second thing that I would point you to is a Dylan scholar named Michael Gray wrote a book titled after the quote I gave earlier. His book is titled Song and Dance Man. And that book is more widely available. You can find a used copy pretty easily for about $20 or $30, even though it's out of print. And his tracing of Dylan's connection to pre-war blues in the United States and to the folk song tradition, even back to Europe, is comprehensive and imposing. It's really extraordinary. Basically, It's about a 400-page document, and pretty close to half the text is footnotes, which can be sometimes annoying to a typical read, but is the kind of thing you're looking for with respect to song traditions.
It sounds like these two things are complementary too. And for me, like I could take both of these things. I can imagine like a wiki project that could take everybody around the world could add in. This would be awesome. Okay, thank you so much.
He'll probably beat you to it.
That's true. That's true.
Maybe I should just put it in the chat GPT.
So Jim, you mentioned that there's a seriousness with Dylan at one point. And I completely got what I felt like that was the description of my experience of Dylan, right? Do you think there's something comparable with the Dead going on? Would you use that same language or?
Yeah, you know, I mean, and there's, you know, they play very different music all through the years, but there's certain periods where they are, where their focus is so honest and uncompromising in delivering this expression. And part of it is in 1969, which was a very volatile time for the country. Those Dark Stars, they played them every concert at Dark Star, and people can listen to them all and they can go, wow, that was great, that was great, that was great, that was great, because they're all doing something different. There's a certain pattern that you can start to pick up a little bit, but it's changing too, and the times are changing and events are happening. People are dying, and then they come out and play, and that they know, and that's part of what happens. And leading up to the Gulf War in '91 was another time when their instrumental jam was all fused with the tangled mess that we were in, trying to figure out what was happening and how it was going to unfold. And I think there are lots of periods where that shows up. And so I think by seriousness, I mean, they're just not going to be deflected by the question that wants to stop what's happening here and reify it into something that's a trophy in a way for the one who's got the attention. Now you got to work harder than that with them. Yeah.
So I saw a documentary on John Lennon a while back, and it leads to these two bands as well, or artists, where a young troubled man is on his estate, and the film crew's there, and John says, no, just let him in, let's see what he has, I want to hear what he has to say. And he was diving into the lyrics and asking, who's the walrus? Are you the walrus? Is Paul the walrus? And what does it mean? And John simply just told him, I don't even know what it means. My lyrics, I don't know what they mean. So don't get too hung up on the lyrics, because as an artist, so with that, it's like, my question is it to where we assume because a word comes out that it's final, and it's like we put a label on it, and that it's this concrete, like they know what they're talking about? Or is it a lot of times they themselves are lost within the process, and it's more of like, what does it do to you, but not trying to figure out what it's done to them?
First of all, I strongly agree. The scholar that I mentioned earlier, Ricks, would definitely be somebody who shaped me in this. I don't believe in the intentional fallacy, right? I don't care whether John Lennon ever met a woman in this particular situation that led to the song Norwegian Wood. It's the art that's relevant, right? Not the biographical details. But that said, Dylan himself has spoken to this issue and has often talked about his songwriting process that we might describe as a kind of automatic songwriting process. Like he will just, playfully engage images that come to him. But that said, I wanted to say something else. Your question glosses the two people in the world who are probably the two most important artists in my life, Dylan and Lennon. And it's hard because Dylan is, famously not always interested in making people feel comfortable as interviewers, as, fans. And I think one of the ways that I read that is he has a thicker ego boundary than, for example, John Lennon. And it enables him, I think, to do some of the work of whether it's automatic writing or not, working with complex symbols, working with artistic materials lyrically and musically, and not feeling threatened by how people might engage them or what expectations they might lay over them. That was sometimes true for John Lennon and sometimes not true. And it feels to me, as somebody who knows his life pretty well from biographies and stuff, that he was oscillating back and forth. I love the Plastic Ono Band album, which is like an album length assertion that he will no longer be troubled by any of those thoughts. And I'm not sure he lived up to that in the remaining 10 years of his life. I see him as somebody, this is me armchair psychologizing, whose ability to create and maintain ego boundaries between himself and the people he was engaging was perhaps not quite as thick as Dylan's. That's the only way I know how to answer that question, because if you walked into my house, you'd be like, this person's really into Bob Dylan and John Lennon. That's what you would think.
Sarah, you had a hand up, right? Oh, Haley, sorry. Okay.
First, I declare I am the one who probably has least knowledge about any of these artists, but I'm going to learn, right? You inspired me. So I'm thinking, normally, this big band, famous established band, they have pressure to produce a lot of stuff because they have to go to tour stuff. They normally have a team of authors behind them to create music or create ideas. What do you think about how they do that? They have the supporting team to help them or to search, to do research, right? And to write or kind of suggesting, polishing song stuff. What's the process behind them?
I'm interpreting Jim's gesture with the microphone to suggest that it's difficult to apply this question to the Grateful Dead, right? Like, again, my understanding of the Dead is very limited, but not only is it improvisational in performance, but the songs that were recorded on studio albums were often improvisationally generated, right? And that there isn't necessarily a traceable songwriting process in the traditional sense, or am I off base on that?
They probably had some processes, processes of the moment. But oh my goodness, they didn't have a secretarial staff working for them, and they didn't have staff researchers working for them. They didn't probably go do research at the library, but they stumbled onto things and were ravenous readers at certain points in their early upbringing, and maybe stayed that way for a long time. Some aspects of their life you don't learn much about because they're private and they don't want to be a spectacle. But I do think that these are instances of people who were very, very well informed because they went after things and they paid attention to things and they were nourished by it and they kept going after more of it. And they were around very cool people who were doing the same things, and things were passing from hand to hand or being shared out loud in bits and pieces. And, so there's, and there's a lot of downtime in the life of a musician when they're touring. So there's time for them to digest what's going on and to generate some creative elements that will begin to show up in the way they're playing, and then later you see that they've grown into a song. And with Grateful Dead, not so much of that because they just kind of bloom their songs when it's time to kind of pull them together, and then they play them for a while to decide if they want to keep them, and they evolve into something that they can't hang on to very long because it's still going to keep moving in new directions. So I think it's more spontaneous and really grounded in their own attunements to things. What makes them interesting to study, because there's a little more possibility that there's something that kind of holds together here around a center, and if we can just get the different facets that are available to us into the same sphere of conversation, maybe it'll all start kind of looking a little more like what we're trying to talk about. And that's the transdisciplinary part of these studies. And I think there's just a wealth of things we can study that way by having experienced what we've experienced. And we have to just get linked to the people who share the experience on their own terms and have a fascination with it. And they're coming from somewhere else. And even if it's the same discipline, it depends on where they've picked up what they've picked up in that discipline. So even there's a lot of cross-fertilization that goes on.
Thank you. I saw Phil that he had a hand up. I do want to wrap up fairly soon, and I have a YouTube question that I would like to pose. So let's see how we're doing with time, and then Phil, I'll take you next. And the question writer can correct me if I'm misreading it. They write, I'm intrigued by the inspiring transdisciplinary scholarship, including the nudge to go beyond relying on reason alone. What suggestions would you give to a quantitative social scientist to benefit from real interdisciplinary wisdom? There's a doozy.
Branch out. Yeah, well, there's a place for it. Even in our conversations about the dead, there's something called Dead Base that went through, I don't know, 11 or 12 or 13 editions before the band stopped performing, and was about gathering all of the kinds of whatevers that might, reflect what's happening here. How many times songs have been played and all kinds of stuff. And we all kind of laughed at it, but we have our copies and we go there for what interests us in there. But I think that anytime you're dealing with quantitative data, you should ask yourself, how much of the question is defined by the structure of the data you're pursuing, and how much of it's driven by the question that you really have, and what is that question? And is quantitative analysis really opening up your relationship to that question? And if not, then there are other ways to cultivate those attunements. And it doesn't mean that you give up your quantitative training, but it might inform your quantitative activities going forward.
All right, let's, Phil, go ahead.
So a number of questions have been percolating through my mind as I've been listening to this, and probably most of them are too esoteric to ask. So I want to try to ask a more pragmatic one. As a US historian, one of the courses that I teach and some of my colleagues teach is contemporary US history. Our students obviously did not directly experience the 60s and the 70s. Without teaching those decades as nostalgia, but we still want to make them feel a connection to this time period. And I've tried to use music as part of that. But I'm asking if you have any particular suggestions that you might offer about how to teach this kind of music, the Dead and Dylan, to students in a way that you perhaps have, by direct experience, have found help them understand the zeitgeist of the era.
I can't pass up the opportunity to talk about something that is one of my favorite things about Dylan as a writer. And it's something that our teacher, Christopher Ricks, first pointed out for me, which is he consistently finds ways to use cliches that exist in the language and widely circulate in the culture in fresh ways. I'll give an example. There's a song called I Shall Be Free, in which he's talking about fantasizing about his parasocial relationship with some famous people. For example, Elizabeth Taylor. And he imagines himself the narrator into this relationship, and he says, I see better days and I do better things. And I love that moment because it highlights two different things we say that are sort of like, what do we really mean when we say that? So I might say, well, I'll tell you, Rich, he's seen better days, right? Which we hear in our culture as an insult, that there's something wrong with Rich's presentation in this moment because I'm comparing it to some expectation I have of Rich's self-presentation. Rich has seen better days. Or, this idea that can't be reflected in the self because it's always outward directed. And he instead reflects that to himself. I see better days, projects it into the future. So he turns around the mirror, he turns around the temporal focus into the future and onto himself, and then concludes this idea, I do better things. The reason, Phil, that it strikes me as one way to answer your question connects back to something I said earlier. As someone who comes to Dylan's work, especially his work from the 60s and 70s, which is acutely observational with respect to the culture around him, he's hilarious. I find myself constantly woken up by his humor, constantly woken up by what he points out. And it's my confident belief that students born in the year 2000 would too. Like, he's observing things they didn't observe, but he's observing them with such tremendous wit and liveliness that I think it would be, using Dylan's work would be one way to make the 60s not just about, well, people were angry about civil rights, people were angry about the Vietnam War, and it was this very weighty time. Like, if you listen to Bob Dylan in 1966, you're like, that's the opposite of the tone of this. So that's one answer that I have from a passionate Dylan fan perspective.
I think the times that you're referencing there, especially the late 60s, mid to late 60s, which are full of a lot of turmoil and also a lot of head in the sand, and so I think we learn a lot from documentaries to kind of get a sense for the energy that was in the streets and in the air, the campaigns to annihilate the Black Panther men, the way the war was being conducted, the way that the population was learning about how the war was conducted, which was opening new vistas that were complicating things, but also really cluing us into some aspects of the day-to-day that we hadn't really had a sense for, and we're suddenly complicit with, to the extent that we weren't going to take a stand against it. So the Grateful Dead are hard to factor into that because they were very deliberate in very few things. But one thing was not to get into a political voice, because they didn't want to get into a voice that tells you what to think about anything. They wanted to drop these koans into your head, basically, and let them arrive, and you're going to be attracted to them because things start happening in your head before you even know the connection between them. And if you don't go that often, you probably don't ever really understand the connection, but it's happened. And so I would say you use that music, for instance, just to kind of drop it into you're having a discussion about some aspects of what was going on in American society at that time, and then you play a song or two that they just have to feel. And then go back to the discussion again, and I think things are already happening, because that's what happened to us when we were listening to those records. We were brought into a feeling that came along with all the stuff that's going on. And it wasn't telling us what's happening, but it was happening in the midst of what was happening. And that's kind of what made that important with Dylan, especially. It's okay, here comes the happening. Ready?
Thank you, Jim.
Recommendations for behavior from Dylan either, brought the same thing.
I think we've gone over a little, so I might put an end to it here. But Sarah, can you just chat with us afterwards and share your question? That would be great. Okay. So another round of applause for both of our authors. Thank you. There's plenty of food, so help yourselves.